Good afternoon and good evening to all of you over in the UK. Today, I want to talk about Bill's vision and the ever-changing plan from 1934 to 1939. Now, there seems to be this largely unspoken belief that Bill Wilson just rolled out of bed at Towns Hospital after having his white light experience, and he already knew exactly what he needed to be done so that he could create this life-saving worldwide movement we call Alcoholics Anonymous. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We're going to see that today. On that day, Bill had no idea where the next 5 years were going to take him. And quite frankly, he only had a slightly better idea of how AA was going to develop on the day the big book was published, April 10th, 1939. So today, I'm going to challenge you to put aside all the wonderful stories that you've heard about early days of AA, because those stories, all those stories have been cherry-picked and given central importance because we already know how AA turned out. So we go back and we look at those stories that kind of explain how we got here, and we just cherry pick them, and we put this big emphasis on them to the extent that other things get lost in the shuffle. And the real meaning of what happened in those days gets lost in the shuffle. So really, there's two ways to look at any kind of history, and that includes early AA history. One might best be called looking backwards. You know, it's like seeing everything that happened in the past through these rose-colored glasses of hindsight. In short, we're picking out important events that led step by step to the place we are today, and we pay attention to those things. Today, I'd like to encourage everybody and follow me as we try and look at those stories going forward. So the point is, I'm trying to get into the hearts and minds of the early principal players, most especially Bill Wilson, as that story unfolded. So I'm trying to look at this from the point of view of those who did not know how the story was going to turn out. So to begin at the beginning of that particularly long journey from 34 to 39 to what might be recognized as anything closely resembling today's Alcoholics Anonymous, let's start with Bill Wilson lying in bed in Towns Hospital in December 1934. Now, people are always talking glowingly about Ebby Thatcher giving Bill Wilson a copy of William James's Varieties, the Varieties of Religious Experience, during that last visit he had to the hospital. And the implication here when people tell this story is that it was really that sparked Bill's vision for the future of Alcoholics Anonymous. Have you ever tried to read Varieties of Religious Experience? I mean, really, have you ever picked up the book and given it a shot? I know smart, really, really smart people with long-term sobriety who are frequently telling me they couldn't make any sense out of that book. No sense whatsoever. But Bill, our legendary walk on water Bill Wilson, was supposed to have been powerfully inspired by his reading of James's book when he was just a day or two sober. Now, here on the East Coast of the United States, we call that being mocus. When you first come in, you're mocus. You can barely make sense out of a paragraph in the New York Times, let alone William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. I mean, really, you think this guy's 2 days sober after doing the belladonna treatment and he's just ravished by what William James has to say? Ernie Kurtz so frequently stated, even when he was sober for a long time, Bill Wilson was not much of a reader. He really wasn't much of a reader. And here's this great letter that I got my friend Jay Stinnett the other day from 1958. Bill writes, he says, I'm still a shopper at the theological pie counter, picking up bits and pieces here and there. I am deeply ashamed to say that I've never read the Old Testament to any extent at all. Respecting the New Testament, I'm only a little less ignorant. Bill was not a great reader. So it wasn't the liberal doctrines of William James that Bill got from Ebby and others in November and December of 1934. It was a heavy dose of Oxford Group teachings. And it was those teachings that exclusively fueled his enthusiasm for sobriety, his own and others, for the next 5 months. So from December 34, Bill gets sober, to May of 1935, when he leaves for Akron, Bill Wilson was a man with a vision and a plan. We're going to talk about visions and plans throughout this entire presentation. And that's a good thing to have a vision and a plan, because as the old cliche goes, a vision without a plan is just a hallucination. You got to have both of them. So from 1934 to 1939, Bill's vision would grow from saving just a few drunks to saving drunks all across the country. And the plans formulated during those years to accomplish those goals were also changing with increasing frequency. And I spoiler alert, most of those plans did not work out as they were intended to work out. So in the beginning, Bill's vision was to save as many drunks as he possibly could, and his plan was to do this by personally, one-on-one, sharing with them what had worked for him. And one element of that plan was to share how his white light experience had removed his desire to drink and set him on the road to permanent recovery. So as Bill's talking to these people, they're all thinking they got to have a white light experience. But beyond this, Bill's primary teaching was the basic tenets of the Oxford group that he was handing to these hopeless cases he was trying to save at Towns Hospital. And he was even talking it up to a former patient from Towns Hospital. So he wrote this guy a letter. Bill Wilson's 1 or 2 months sober at the most. It's January, February 1935. And he writes to Roger, someone that he had met when they were both patients at Towns Hospital. And Bill's selling Roger on the Oxford group solution he's just discovered, man. He says, I had a friend who took to firing shotguns around the house, and the neighbors weren't at all sold on the idea. And the judge was about to send him over to the state bug house when there appeared out of the haze 2 members of the so-called Oxford group. They worked with him a bit, brought him to New York, and he is indisputably cured, though he was obviously far beyond any medical help. The upshot of it all was that, to my amazement, I got religion too. And I'm spending some time at Towns working with some of the hopeless cases. And of course, there's not been time to demonstrate much of anything, but the Dr. Silkworth is perfectly willing to admit that this Oxford crowd has a lot on the ball. That I am riding the holy roller coaster may seem incredible to you, Roger, but I'm taking the liberty of sending you a book which had something to do with pushing me over and which will explain more of what happened than I might on a bale of paper. Whatever your sentiments, you are bound to be fascinated by the thing as a remarkable human interest story. So here's Bill pitching this guy that he spent some time at Towns Hospital with. I'm saying I got the answer, and I am riding the holy roller coaster. Now we don't know what book Bill sent to Roger. It's not mentioned in the letter, but it was probably either Soul Surgery by Mr. Walter or For Sinners Only by Russell. Those were published in 1919 and 1932 respectively, or it might have been What is the Oxford Group or I Was a Pagan by Vic Kitchen, published in 33 and 1934. Now personally, my best guess is that it was I Was a Pagan, because when Bill says to Roger, he says that you're bound to be fascinated by the thing as a remarkable human interest story. Really, the only one that really overpoweringly has a human interest story is Vic Kitchen's personal testimony in that book, I Was a Pagan. I am a pagan. So the point is, Bill was firmly and deeply engaged with the Oxford group at this time. He was most certainly not preaching some liberal vision of sobriety based on William James' varieties of experience. At this point in early sobriety, let's call a spade a spade. Bill Wilson was staying sober with Jesus. The only other contemporary document I found for this early period of Bill's sobriety is a round robin letter that Lois Wilson writes to 3 of her friends, and it's dated July 20th. So it's after Bill gets out of Towns Hospital, but it's still mid-1935. At this point, Bill is out in Ohio with Dr. Bob and a couple of other guys that are trying to get sober. And she says the biggest and most important news is that Bill has stopped drinking through the Oxford group. This has been a subject that in the past I would not think of mentioning even when he was on the wagon for a while, but I am so sure of his cure now that the Oxford group has helped take away the shame by meeting many other fine men who have been similarly ill and recovered as Bill has, that I am so happy about it that I want everybody to know about it. She says, it seemed that we have done everything that was humanly possible to help him. Doctors, psychologists, drunk sanitariums, Christian Science, even months in the country on a farm away from all bad influences. Nothing did any good. But then last December, Abby Thatcher appeared sober for the first time in years and with a very strange story to tell about a religion called the Oxford Group, which had cured him just as he was about to be committed to an insane asylum. I want to say that one of the main ideas of this group is to help somebody else, and Bill has by now quite a number of drunks in tow, which he either has or is helping shake out of it, thereby not only helping them, but making his own cure all the more secure, all the more sure. And those drunks that he had in tow are, of course, those guys, the few guys that are out in Ohio. So what are the basic teachings of the Oxford group at this time? What are we talking about? What's Bill Wilson preaching to these guys? The moral teachings of the Oxford group are found in the 4 absolutes. This is going to be a quick sketch of the OG. So absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute selfishness, absolute love. Absolute. The Oxford group also had 4 basic spiritual principles. sharing our sins and temptations with another Christian, restitution of all whom we have wronged, directly or indirectly, surrendering our lives, past, present, and future, to God's keeping and direction, and last, listening for God's guidance and carrying it out. Now, obviously, that's going to sound pretty familiar to some AA people, but we're going to move on. The Oxford group also believed that people could change their lives if they honestly embrace their program based on the 5 C's. What are the 5 C's? Confidence that when we share those secrets, they're going to be kept. Confession, complete honesty about everything. Conviction, owning the seriousness of our sins. Conversation, surrendering to God, your own free will. And continuance, helping others to change. So that's the 5C program of the Oxford group. The Oxford group also held large gatherings that they called house parties. This was a real regular thing going on with the OG in the US, and I presume elsewhere. The Oxford group team organized these parties where people came to relate their experiences with the, quote, group way of life, end quote. And attendance was by printed invitations sent to key people in the community. And Bill and Lois attended several of these house parties in 1935, 1936, and actually in the first month of 1937, as we'll see. In addition to the house parties, Bill participated in the small groups of men formed to seek guidance for one another. Now, a lot of we think, you got to seek guidance for yourself, but in the OG, you were seeking guidance for other people. And according to Lois, the Oxford group, as we knew it back in the early months of 1935, Bill's just got sober in December of 34, worked in teams of 6 to a dozen, sitting quietly together, listening for the guidance of God for each one. Bill belonged to a team for a while, but I didn't. The rest of the team would get guidance for him to work with such and such a person in order to bring him to God. Bill usually had different guidance and felt no identity with the person they selected. They're always looking for him to work with some rich guy down on Wall Street. And he became annoyed at being told what to do. Imagine that. He knew he could be far more useful working with alcoholics with whom he could identify. So many years later, and with the benefit of the clarity that only comes from crystal clear hindsight, Bill noted that the problem was that the Oxford group wanted to save the world, and I only wanted to save the drunks. And there's a huge amount of truth in that. There's certainly a large thing of truth in that. From his very first days of his sobriety, Bill Wilson was committed to spending his free time trying to save the drunks. That was his focus. He was working with the drunks. But at this point, he didn't have any real plan on how to do that effectively. We got no plan whatsoever. The very beginning of Bill Wilson's beginnings of his turning away from a total reliance on the Oxford group can be placed in the days just before he left for a business trip to Akron in April of 1935. So note well that Bill was aggressively pursuing an active career outside of AA. There is no AA, but I mean, with hindsight, we would have to say outside of AA. In this particular time of his sobriety, there was no plan yet for anything even vaguely resembling the fellowship at this point. So Bill is certainly committed to saving drunks on a part-time basis, but he's desperately looking for a prestigious and well-paying full-time job. And it was exactly that desire that faithfully took him to Akron, Ohio in April of 1935. He's chasing this. He's going to be president of this company. In the previous 4 months, Bill had not been able to get a single person sober. And as he prepared to leave this missionary work that he was doing at Towns Hospital behind in the pursuit of a new and lucrative career, he complains bitterly to Dr. Silkworth over the failure of all his efforts during the previous 4 months. The doctor advises him, stop preaching at them and give them the hard medical facts first. This may soften them up at death so that they'll be willing to do anything to get well. Then they may accept those religious ideas of yours and even a God. So this is Silkworth telling Wilson he's got to stand down a bit and shift gears and start paying attention to the medical stuff as well as all this spiritual stuff he's talking about. Those hard medical facts Silkworth wanted Bill to include in his approach to drinkers were his own theories about alcoholism, namely that they suffered from an obsession of the mind that compels them to drink and an allergy of the body that condemns them to go mad. But placing a strong emphasis on the medical aspects of alcoholism was directly contradictory to the Oxford group belief that they already had a purely religious solution for curing alcoholism. They did not want to hear anything about this medical aspect then. So out in Akron, while Bill is fruitlessly chasing the presidency of the National Machinery Rubber Company, he got powerfully thirsty one day. And he realized that although he had not been able to get anyone else sober in the past few months, clearly his working with alcoholics was what had kept him sober. I believe this is really the very, very first small seed that presages the growth of the fellowship that is yet to come. Bill realized if he wanted to stay sober, he needed to be talking to an active alcoholic. When all other measures failed, as it says in our book, work with another alcoholic would save the day. So on May 12th, 1935, Bill Wilson meets with Dr. Bob Smith for the first time, and also for the first time, he puts Dr. Silkworth's advice into practice. And as he says in the second forward to our book, he says, when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. So we've got the medical stuff and we got the spiritual remedy in there. He sobered, never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. So now we've got two guys sober in Akron, Ohio. But does that mean that we've got a larger plan yet? No, no larger plan. What we got is two guys who are sober in Akron, Ohio. Now, with hindsight, you look back and say, oh, well, this is the very beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous. But it didn't look anything like that to these guys at the time. We got two guys sober. And did they have a vision? Did they have a plan? Well, kind of. The two men, this is right out of the book. The two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving at the ward at the Akron City Hospital. And this is solidly based on Bill's newfound realization, pacing the floor of the Mayflower Hotel, that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. And over the next 10 weeks, these two guys sobered up 3 more guys. So now we got 5 sober guys out in Ohio. And what's their plan? We're going to sober up more guys by hitting them with the hard medical facts. And then we're going to get them on their knees to surrender to God. And then we're going to take them to a whole bunch of Oxford group meetings. That's our deal. That's what we're doing. And that's where they were when Bill went back to New York after spending 4 months in Akron. Do we have a working plan yet? Do we have Alcoholics Anonymous yet? No. What we got is 4 guys sober out in Akron and 1 in New York City who's just lost the best job opportunity to come his way in years. These guys are all still deeply immersed in the Oxford group. The only meetings they're going to are Oxford group meetings where alcoholics are typically in the minority. In short, we now have 5 of them who are staying sober with Jesus. Bill came back to New York with a new confidence in this first hit them with the hard medical facts approach. Then once you do that, then you get them to surrender to God. And it worked. This modified Oxford group gospel of recovery that Bill was preaching at Towns Hospital started to get people sober. It worked first with Hank Parkhurst in September of 1935. Bill had come back in August. And then with Fitz Mayo 2 months later in November of 1935. And now the story of the atheistic Hank's surrender to God is told in his big book story, The Unbeliever. And the prominence of the Oxford group teaching and especially well described in the very first draft version of Fitzmayo's story for the big book. This was modified before it was ever printed, but I've seen this out in Stepping Stones, his first version. So a patient in Towns Hospital tells Fitz, he says, there are men on the streets of New York today who are worse than you, and they don't drink anymore. And Fritz says, how's that possible? How could that possibly be true? And the man asked, would you be willing to live on a new basis, try to live up to ideals by trying to be absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving? Sound familiar? In all your relationships with your fellow men to get rid of the drink problem? Of course I would, I declared without much thought. I'd do anything. Then all your troubles are over, said the man, and he left the room. So this is what's getting Fitz sober in November of 1935. While Bill Wilson doesn't have any kind of concrete plan for expanding the reach of the fellowship after he returned to New York, the newly sober Hank Parkhurst most certainly did. We're going to hear a lot of Hank's plans in this thing. Hank's a big motive force, as everybody knows who's read my book. In late November of 1935, Hank's just 2 months sober. He formed a corporation called Sharing Incorporated. So Hank's 2 months sober, and he's already off and running with his plan. This is a Delaware corporation, literally set up. It's got 30,000 shares of stock. Hank is the president of Sharing Incorporated. Bill Wilson is the treasurer of Sharing Incorporated, and he receives Bill gets 150 shares, and they're literally dated November 29th, 1935. So that's just a little bit over a year, not even a year after Bill got sober himself. So there's no further contemporary information on this company or its purposes, but calling it Sharing Incorporated most certainly suggests that its purpose harkens back to the first of those Oxford Group spiritual principles just noted. Bill and Hank are still most definitely in. They are in the Oxford Group. These are Oxford Group guys. They're staying sober in and with the Oxford Group. But whatever its purpose, Sharing Incorporated, it wasn't just something that happened just in November 1935. Months later, Bill is still considering a going concern of some sort. He writes, he's on the road, he writes to Lois in April and July of 36. And he types Sharing Incorporated across the top of it like it's an official letterhead. And there's even a Midtown address of 11 West 42nd Street, right down by the triangular building there in Midtown, New York. So 1 month after the formation of Sharing Incorporated, Bill Wilson's attending a very large late December house party in Richmond, Virginia. And both Frank Buchman and Sam Shoemaker, who's the head of Calvary Church and the head of the Oxford Group in the United States of America, Frank Buchman is the founder of the Oxford Group, both of those guys are there. And at this point, this is December of 1935. Bill's 1 year sober, Hank's 3 months sober, and Fitz is 1 month sober. So he writes back to Lois from Virginia. He says, "Darling, I love you so very much and think of you a lot. I am really quite happy I came, and I have begun to feel much better, though I'm determined to get to bed early." It is now noon, and morning had been taken up mostly by Frank Buchman, who is so sane yet possessing great power. He is much on the lookout for practical, two-fisted people who know what things are about and willing to do something. There can be little to fear in the way of restraint from him. Tell Hank that I'm quite sorry for letting his arguments increase my obstinacy about coming. So already Bill and Hank are arguing over stuff, and Hank's all of 2 months sober at this point. Hank's wife Kathleen was down in Virginia with Bill, so maybe it had something to do with that. I don't know. And then he tells Lois that in the morning quiet time, Shep Cornell, who was one of the guys who was visiting Bill at Towns Hospital, very sweetly prayed for both of you. And he says it looks like it will be a never-ending series of meetings, and one is starting right now. Much love, Bill. Boom. So further proof of this total immersion of the early New York group into the Oxford Group can be found in a letter Hank Parkhurst, a flaming atheist, just a few short months earlier. He writes to Sam Shoemaker early in his sobriety about his new plan. Okay, we had the Sharing Incorporated plan. Now we have another new plan. February 1936, Hank is just 5 months sober. 5 months sober. He sends Sam his plan for changing America. He has a new plan. Having been a businessman, I know that American people like organization. An army on the march needs coordination, and God needs a spark plug to bring the American machine to life. Hank follows this up with a fairly detailed 13-point plan, and he concludes by telling Shoemaker, if there's any idea here that might be the basis of helpful conversation, I am at your command. Now, in short, what he's saying to Sam is, if you want the Oxford Group to really change America, then I'm the spark plug that you are looking for. Typical Hank Parkhurst sentiment. Although Sharing Incorporated is not explicitly mentioned in this letter, just 3 months after the company's been found, Hank does propose that the, quote, first step for the realization of his plan for the Oxford Group to improve their effectiveness worldwide might be the establishing of a clearinghouse to organize that expansion. Perhaps I'm speculating, Sharing Incorporated would have been offered to Sam had this clearinghouse if Shoemaker thought his ideas were worth pursuing. Instead, Sam let Hank down rather gently by telling him that most of the suggestions that he had were already in place, and he referred Hank to the people currently doing those jobs. Other than these two letters already mentioned, we never hear again about Sharing Incorporated. None. So now we've reached March of 1936. Bill Wilson is now 16 months sober. So what is the state of this small group of recovering alcoholics in March of 1936 with Bill being 16 months sober? Do we have anything even vaguely resembling AA yet in either New York or out in Akron? No. Do we have anything like a working plan for organization and expansion yet? No. But there is one important new development. There's incremental things that happen throughout this story. One more important new development that moves the New York drunks in the direction of what would eventually evolve into AA as we know it. Bill Wilson starts holding alcoholics only meeting after the regular Sunday meeting Oxford group meetings, the Sunday afternoon Oxford group meetings. Leaving that regular mixed Oxford group meeting with the Calvary Church Mission, the drunks moved down the street to a place called Stewart's Cafeteria, where they would talk, Bill said, on into the night. There's all kinds of mixed reports, but we got no hard evidence on how, why, or when these cafeteria meetings actually began. Those new drunks only meetings were in stark contrast to the Oxford group meetings, which included a majority of non-alcoholics. Note that while the New York initiated their drunks only meeting sometime likely in early 1936, the Akron group would not adopt a drunks only format for their meetings until December of 1939, months and months after the book was published. At some point, those cafeteria meetings got to be just too big. And I'm guessing that was sometime in mid-1936. So those Sunday meetings, drunks only meetings, they moved them to the Bill Wilson's house in Brooklyn. And they started meeting there every Sunday. One final and tremendously important event occurs in late 1936 that helped to shape the vision and the way AA continued to develop during these early years. Charlie Towns offered Bill Wilson a very, very lucrative full-time job at his hospital as a lay therapist. And Wilson really wanted to take this job. He needed a job bad. He was looking for some income here. And he came close to taking that job. But when Towns' offer was brought up at the regular Sunday night meeting at Bill's house, the group's opinion was not what he had hoped for. According to Bill, they said, "Don't you realize that you can never become a professional? You tell us Charlie's proposal is ethical." Oh, sure, it's ethical, but what we've got here won't run on ethics only. It has to be better. Sure, Charlie's idea is good, but it isn't good enough. This is a matter of life and death, Bill, and nothing but the very best will do. You can't take the job. And Wilson did, in fact, turn down the job. And this is an incredible turning point in early AA history. It's hard to imagine that the fellowship and the program would have ever developed if Bill Wilson had become a paid professional therapist on the staff of a nationally known hospital at this time. So, I mean, that doesn't fit the vision or the plan that would logically result in today's Alcoholics Anonymous at all. At all. Thanks for those guys talking Bill Wilson out of taking his job. In the same month as that Towns job offer, Lois's diary records some wonderful details about a house party that she and Bill attended. It was at a Pocono house party. Pocono's over in New York State, December 4th through the 6th. So it's a 3-day party at the end of 1936. And she also wrote about some of the guidance that received at this gathering. This is the kind of thing, by the way, we've got these reports from Lois on things that were going on with her in these Oxford group meetings, and also Ann Smith. There's Ann Smith's spiritual diary that records these kind of things. We do not have anything for Bill or for Dr. Bob, unfortunately, but this is the kind of thing that was going on in the Oxford group with Bill, Lois, Wilson at this time. She says, "This is really funny to me that I've been in the groups for nearly 2 years trying to help and somebody. Then I realized that I had not really put my reliance in God, but had been trying under guidance as I thought to do it all myself. And it was only this afternoon through helping a friend that I really saw myself." And she says, I've got to be, these are little notes to herself, "Be free of myself. Comparatively easy to be free of other people, but self is a chain that is terribly hard to cast off." And then she does this list of sins. She's accusing herself, feeling of being special, self-consciousness, feeling of inferiority in contact with people, but superiority of actual worth, self-indulgence in small things, dependence on human love. Sin binds and deadens. Doubting of Christ. Nonsense, you know. So 5 weeks later, Lois's diary notes they attended yet another house party. This one is in West Point on January 10th, 1937. So now we're bleeding over into 1907. This is the first month of 1937. And once again, she records her own thoughts and the convictions that others have pointed out to you. That would they would point out faults in each other. Anyone criticizing me, I am immediately angry. Fear of giving up that special private citadel oneself's. Not think about myself all the time. Not sink way down in my chair so bookmen won't see to call on me. Fear of all kinds of will disappear if self is forgotten. Unfortunately, if Bill ever made any kind of similar notes, they have not been preserved in the archive. I would love to see Bill's notes and Dr. Bob's notes, but we haven't found any of those yet. But so if Bill was so desperate for a job during 1936 and 1937, how much was he working with drunks during those years? I mean, not as much as you would think. He was constantly on the road doing freelance jobs. Now, this is likely not a complete list of Bill's business trips, but from the letters that are preserved in the archive and Lois's diaries, we do know that Bill was on the road a lot during these years. 1936, April, he's in Cleveland, Akron, Newton, Ohio, Iowa, Chicago, and Syracuse, 3 weeks on the road. April, most of the month, not even in New York. June, Detroit and Cleveland, several days on the road. July, he's in Detroit, several days on the road. He's working for Quah and Foley on that particular trip. September, Cleveland, Akron, Detroit, at least a week on the road. 1937. Now, by this time, early 1937, he gets himself a full-time job with this firm, Quah and Foley, and he's out there looking for investment prospects for them. January, he's 3 days on the road in Boston. January through February, he's 2 weeks on the road in St. Louis and Detroit. February, he's in Detroit for a couple of days. March, he's in Boston for a couple of days. April, he's 2 weeks on the road in Cleveland. May, he's 2 weeks on the road in Cleveland. And then later in May, he's 4 days on the road. And in June, several days on the road in St. Louis. In September, he's a whole week on the road in Detroit. Then finally, on October 8th, 1937, Bill Wilson lost his job with Quah and Foley. There'd been a big stock market crash the previous May, I believe, and it really tightened everything up, and they had to let Bill Wilson go. But this would prove to be another one of the major turning points in early Alcoholics Anonymous history. So we're going to leave Bill for a second, talk about Hank. How much time was he spending with drunks in late 1936 to the end of 1937? Not as much as you would think. He had founded Honor Dealers, this business that he was trying to get off the ground, in November of 1936, and it was pretty much an all-consuming job to get that company up and running, with a full-time secretary and several salesmen to manage. On the other hand, Dr. Bob was constantly busy working with drunks. His proctology practice had not picked up too much at this point, and all by himself, Dr. Bob was almost twice as successful as his two fireball partners in New York City. He was really getting there. Wilson later, after he died, he called him the Prince of the 12 Steppers. But Dr. Bob was, he was brilliant working one-on-one with people. He really, really was. He was a tour de force of sobriety out in Ohio. But whatever work was being done to get people sober, all of those efforts were still being done deep within the beliefs and practices of the Oxford Group. In New York, Bill Rudell gets sober in February of 1937. We're up to February of 1937 here. Silkworth refers in the bill. He says, if you want to stay sober, you got to go talk to Bill Wilson. And Bill was in town at the point, and Rudell and his wife went over there for dinner. And after dinner, he says, this is Bill Rudell, says Kathleen and I, that would be his wife, knelt down in front of the fireplace in your upstairs parlor with both you and Lois, and I made the surrender. And so this whole idea of surrendering to God. Bob Evans was also sober in February 37, and this is what he says about the first Akron meeting that he went to at that time. He said, the group demanded an on-your-knees surrender. You couldn't go to a meeting until you did it. You couldn't go to a meeting until you got on your knees and surrendered to God. If by accident you didn't make your surrender in the hospital, where most of them did, you had to make it in the upper bedroom over the Williams' house just before the regular Wednesday night meeting began. So the Oxford Group method of get on your knees and surrender your life to God, and I'm saying God there, I really believe most of these people were surrendering their life to Jesus. Well, it was still being practiced in New York in February of 1937, but this was about to change radically. Because in April and May of 1937, the New York group formally broke away from the Oxford Group. And this is another major turning point in Alcoholics Anonymous. On the other hand, the Akron group continued to be deeply enmeshed with the Oxford Group for the next 3 years. This is Earl Treat's description of his first meeting in Akron in April of 1937, just 2 months after Bill Rudell had surrendered in New York. He says, I remember most distinctly the first meeting that I attended. Bill Dotson sat with a Holy Bible in his lap. The meeting was opened with a prayer. Bill read excerpts from the Bible and translated them into everyday life. After half an hour of this, the meeting was thrown open to everyone in the room, and they in turn picked up some of these passages from the Bible that they had discussed and gave their interpretations. Then the meeting was closed with the Lord's Prayer. Then coffee and donuts and discussion of people and what they could do to better live our lives. So in our meetings, a belief in God was very definitely a fact. It was a spiritual program. I love this. Clarence Schneider. Clarence Schneider comes into AA He's our firebrand. We're going to hear more about him. February of 1938. He gives his surrender to Dr. Bob Smith in the hospital. This is Clarence's own version of how this went. He said they both got on their knees, and Dr. Clarence said, I don't know how to pray. But Bob said, I'll tell you, just repeat after me. So Bob coaches him by saying what? This is what he says. Jesus, they're on their knees. Jesus, this is Clarence Schneider. He's a drunk. Clarence, this is Jesus. Ask him to come into your life. Ask him to remove your drinking problem and pray that he managed your life because you are unable to manage it yourself. When Clarence showed up at his first meeting, he was immediately handed a piece of paper by one of the sober men. And this is what it said. Therefore, if any be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Corinthians. And Clarence said, he read that and he broke down crying. Here's Dorothy. This is Clarence's wife, Dorothy. Her description of a typical 1938 meeting in Akron. She says the men would all disappear upstairs. And then after about a half an hour or so, down would come the new man, shaking, white, serious, and grim. And all the people who were already sober would come trooping down after him. They were pretty reluctant to talk about what had happened, but after a while they would tell us that they had had a real surrender. I often wonder how many of the people that come in now would agree with the Oxford Group's version of the Word of God or anything spiritual and really survive an experience like that. It was a regular old-fashioned prayer meeting. Indeed. So, have we got AA yet? Do we have a working vision yet? Do we have a plan yet? No. But significant moves in that direction are about to begin shortly. Those moves began right after the New York group severed all their ties with the Oxford group. And this is Bill Rudell again telling about that particular thing happening. He said, the final parting came in the spring of 1937 because Kathleen and I had started coming to meetings in your house in February of 1937. And we attended with those meetings on Sunday nights in Sam Shoemaker's church. As we remember it, the decision to disassociate from the Oxford group was made at a meeting in your home. And at that time, it was a very serious decision. You talked it over at one of the group meetings and the decision was made. So this New York break from the Oxford group, this is really one of the big decisive moments in early Alcoholics Anonymous. It's going to lead to the creation of the first real plan. Finally, we're going to get ourselves a plan here for organizing and spreading the message of recovery nationally. Now, listen, nothing happens in a vacuum. I mean, there's no big revolution. Boom, everything changes on a dime. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything that happens is a product of a long and evolving process of events. And the elements that led to Bill's and his fellow drunks' dissatisfaction with the Oxford group in New York were many, many. And it's likely that the New York group had been slowly distancing themselves from the Oxford group in small ways for some time. I mean, that whole thing about the absolutes. I know Bill Wilson was never a dogmatic guy. You start doing that absolute stuff to Bill Wilson, and I'm sure he was going in the other direction pretty quickly. Nonetheless, up to this point, the Oxford group had provided them with their identity. They were the alcoholic squad within the Oxford group, along with the basics of their program of recovery. And they've been riding on the broad coattails of the Oxford group for the past 2.5 years. But now that connection in New York is broken. Suddenly the questions of who we are, how do we identify ourselves, how do we organize ourselves, how can we best spread our message become burning issues for these guys. It's time to take control, to reorganize and create a plan for rapidly expanding our we want to get this thing going nationally. I'm sure Hank Parkhurst was one of the guys lighting a fire under this stuff. And less than 6 months after their break with the Oxford group, before all these issues became burning issues, Bill Wilson has answers to all those questions, along with a fully formulated expansion plan, and he takes it out to Akron, along with at least 3 New Yorkers who are going to help him vote these plans in for that group's approval. And this is the famous counting noses, where supposedly they counted and they had 40 people sober, and it's like, oh my God, we got 40 people sober. We gotta get this message out to California quick. That happened in mid-October of 1937. Now, this was nothing less than a summit meeting of the alcoholic squad of the Oxford group, hoping to chart a course for bringing their newly discovered cure to alcoholics everywhere. And Bill's proposed plan, here's the plan. We're gonna have a string of hospitals nationally, alcoholic hospitals only. We're gonna have paid workers. People are gonna go out and start meetings, and people are gonna bring patients into these hospitals. And then we got to write a book about how it is we're staying sober. Now, however bold it might be, Bill's vision wasn't yet alcoholics only specific. I find this almost shocking because it just doesn't fit the stories as they're always told. It was Bill's vision was still clouded by this Oxford Group platform to reform the entire world. He claims in one of his early writings about this counting noses meeting, he claims that he told the Akron Group why we only have to sober up all these boys and girls and sell them God, whereupon we would revolutionize society. A brand new world with ex-drunks running it. Just think of that, folks. If we had time, we could pause here for a little while to think about that, because that was a pretty damn shocking thought to me, but we're going to move on. Later, Wilson candidly admitted that the grandiosity of his own schemes at this time in Alcoholics Anonymous comes of age. He recalled later, AA's uncompromising honesty might soon clean up politics. There's a thought for you. In the factories, it could cause laborers and capitalists to love each other. Really? We thought AA might prove to be the spearhead of a new spiritual advance. Our principles might transform the world. So he's still doing this Oxford Group stuff. And those grandiose ideas did not die a quick death. The idea that AA's principles being carried to non-alcoholics even surfaced in the very first version of the steps when the 12th step was first written in early December of 1938. And that step started off by saying, having had a spiritual experience as the result of this course of action, try to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics, and to practice these principles in all your affairs. So it's not just, the whole thing isn't this spiritual experience isn't going to just save alcoholics, it's going to save others too, all kinds of people. Wilson later claimed that this October 1937 plan for a string of alcoholics recovery hospitals all across the country, along with a paid staff to bring patients to those hospitals, were quickly abandoned. He says, we realized that wasn't going to work, so we just focused on the book. That is not true. That is not what was going on. In February of 1938, for instance, Bill and Bob were desperately hoping that John D. Rockefeller Jr. would finance an alcoholic recovery hospital for Dr. Bob in Akron. And in August of 1938, the possibility of opening such a hospital in Washington, D.C. consumed almost a month of Bill Wilson's time before it went south and collapsed. In New York, they continued to try to establish their own local alcoholic hospital. And finally, in 1945, early 1945, they succeeded in taking over the third floor of Knickerbocker Hospital, which was devoted exclusively to alcoholics and largely staffed by recovering alcoholics. It remained in operation until 1954. Nor did the idea of paid workers ever go away. Bill, Hank, and Fitz had no independent source of income at this point, and they were most certainly looking for a way that this new recovery movement could pay them for all the hard work they were doing, get people sober. The Counting Noses meeting in mid-October of 1937 had just barely approved Bill's plan for hospitals, paid workers, and a book, and he was helped mightily by those 3 New York votes that he brought to Ohio with him in his back pocket. But Akron claimed that although we're going to barely approve this plan, you're not going to get any money out of us. We're not going to do that. So they sent Bill back to New York City to raise the money there. And for the next 7 months, from October 37 to May of 1938, all of Hank's and Bill's efforts were completely devoted to trying to raise money for this plan to found hospitals with paid workers, while the plan to write the book was put on the back burner. December 1937, they meet with the Rockefellers and roll out the plan for the Rockefeller guys. February, Dr. Bob has Frank Amos, one of the Rockefeller guys out in Ohio, and he's showing them 3 possible sites for this Akron Alcoholic Hospital. March of 1938, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Coughs up only $5,000, and that's basically to keep Dr. Bob going, and he won't give him anything else. March of 1938, Hank Parker's popping up again with a new plan. Hank's always got a new plan. We're going to set up the Alcoholic Fund. It's going to collect money from all these rich people that we're going to talk to. April of 1938, Bill goes out to Akron and he talks up the book project again. But this did not go well that time, and Bill did not take a vote on it. But they were not in favor of it. They thought a book was going to be cause more problems for them than they were going to solve. May of 1938, Hank has an even newer plan. What we need is 2 sample chapters of the book. And once we've got those, we can really, that's going to be the big door opener for us to get appointments with these rich people in New York City. And we're going to get the money for the hospitals and the paid workers. So Hank convinces Bill of the wisdom of this plan. And on May 18th, 1938, Charles Towns contributes $500 as an advance on the book project. And on May 20th, 1938, Bill Wilson began to write those first two chapters for the big book, Bill's Story and There Is a Solution. But even as Bill wrote in May to June of 1938, there's still no plan to actually write the whole book. There's no plan to write the whole book. The two chapters he proposed, There Is a Solution, he produced, There Is a Solution, and Bill's Story, were solely meant to be sales promotion pieces to get them appointments with potential rich donors. So, before continuing with Bill and Hank's valiant efforts to raise money for their hospitals and paid worker plan, we need to take a little side trip on Bill's expanding vision. And this is David, this is one of our grow and understanding things right here. You know, this is Bill Wilson's grow and understanding in relation to his personal vision as he's writing these two first chapters. Whatever mercenary motives Bill may have had when he started writing There Is a Solution, get appointments to get money, that's a mercenary motive. Something really mysterious and almost magical happened along the way. Something I have called Bill Wilson's true moment of genius. And I want to give honor to that particular moment of genius that Bill Wilson had in May and early June of 1938. In his own story, and in There Is a Solution, Bill presents for the very first time his brilliant diagnosis of the alcoholic's problem. Namely, that if you are a real alcoholic, you have no defense against the first drink. This is Bill Wilson's diagnosis of what your problem is. In these two very first chapters written about their solution, Wilson locates the alcoholic's problem not in the fact that they can't stop drinking once they start, which is Dr. Silkworth's theory about the phenomenon of craving and the allergy, but rather in the fact that the alcoholic have an aberrant mind, one that insanely convinces them that they can safely take the first drink. Now, this emphasis on the insanity of picking up the first drink will continue to be explained in more about alcoholism and how it works, and working with others, and two wives, and in a vision for you. It just comes up repeatedly over and over and over again in all the stuff Bill Wilson writes for the big book. I said that brilliant diagnosis was mysterious and magical and a clear sign of genius because I can find no other instance. I would love for people to help me with this. I can find no other instance of this ingenious and insightful diagnosis in any previous writings about alcoholism or in any of the writings done by other people at this time. It just miraculously appears out of nowhere. It can be found, but it can be found over and over in everything Bill Wilson writes for the big book. But it doesn't appear anywhere else in any of the contemporary records. For instance, in the 28 personal stories in the first edition of the big book, I just went back and reread these things, looking for some evidence of this. No one mentions anything even remotely resembling this central and critical understanding of why an alcoholic simply cannot stay sober. And yet it shows up repeatedly in all the things Bill I for the big book. I got to run through a couple of examples because sometimes people just don't believe me when I say this thing. In Bill's story written in late May, he said, shortly afterwards, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. I hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Was I crazy? And then he says, then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. The insidious insanity of that first drink. In There Is a Solution, written in early June, right after he wrote Bill's story, he says that we're talking about our friend, these observations would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink. Therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than his body. And what this guy's drinking, right? He has no more idea why he took that first drink than you have. And the almost certain consequences that follows taking even a glass of beer do not crowd out the mind to deter us. There is a complete failure of the kind of defense that keeps one from putting his hand on a hot stove. How's that for a beautiful analogy? In More About Alcoholism, which he writes in late September 38, Bill says, Jim putting the whiskey in his milk can only be called plain insanity. Then after presenting the jaywalker analogy, he says, such a man would be crazy, wouldn't he? And in that same chapter, when talking about Fred, his AA visitors tell Fred's in the hospital, about those strange mental blank spots and the subtle insanity which precedes the first drink. This is the diagnosis of Fred's problem that he ignores and so paid the price with another horrendous drunk. In Working with Others, written in late September 38, the primary message to be delivered to the alcoholic is show him the mental twist which leads to the first drink of a spree. show him from your own experience how the queer mental condition surrounding that first drink prevents normal functioning of the willpower. And then in A Vision for You, written in November 1938, Bill tells of his great temptation moment in the Mayflower Hotel, and he says, describing that, he says, again, it was the old insidious insanity, that first drink. The moment of insanity that he overcame by reaching out to find another alcoholic to talk to. In that same chapter, he tells a story about he and Dr. Bob go see the man on the bed. And what does Bill say that they told him when they went? He says, we told there was much talk about the mental state preceding the first drink. And yet, other than these stories that Bill Wilson wrote for the Big Book in 1938, I can find no evidence of anyone else talking about this brilliant diagnosis of the problem. Namely, that the real alcoholic with no booze whatsoever in his body has no defense against the insanity of picking up that first drink. Any careful reading of the first 164 pages of the Big Book reveals at least 77 clear references to Bill's diagnosis of the alcoholic's basic problem. He suffers from the insanity of picking up the first drink. And there's many references to the solution, the need for a vital spiritual experience. So we've talked about Bill's vision of saving drunks, but nothing I have found before or after his writing about this in the Big Book explains where this brilliant diagnosis came from. And quite frankly, most shocking to me, there is no mention of the insanity of the first drink or of these strange mental block spots to be found anywhere in the 12 and 12. Anywhere. This is really, in my opinion, Bill Wilson's moment of genius. It's so far unexplained. I wish I could explain it. I can't explain it. It just pops up out of nowhere. Here's this great cartoon out of New Yorker. And then the miracle occurred. Well, I think this is the miracle that occurred in May, June of 1938, and the original caption on this is, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. And indeed, we do need to be more explicit about came to believe in a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The insanity we're being relieved of is not the crazy things we did while drinking. It's the insidious insanity of picking up the first drink. Thank you, Bill, for that brilliant insight into the alcoholic's basic problem. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so hopefully that little side trip didn't distract you too much from the thread of the story here. Remember, we were trying to follow the money, but in the case of Overly Alcoholics Anonymous, following the lack of money for their grandiose plans is really what we're doing. So June 17th, 1938, with those typed copies of those 2 new chapters in hand, Hank and Bill immediately begin to send them out to anyone they thought might be a good prospect to become a donor for their plan. And now all these crazy months and months of work here. They go to Maryland and they get these recommendations from a couple of top psychiatrists at Johns Hopkins. Bill has to borrow money. He's got no money. He borrows some money from Fitz Mayo's sister, $1,000. July 15th, Bill writes a letter to Bob and tells him about the trip south. And he notes that he has plans to contact and make sales pitches to the presidents of RCA, NBC, US Steel, General Motors, JP Morgan. Still no money. Nothing's happening. Hank's having trouble paying the rent on his office. So Honor Dealer moves around the corner to a cheaper place in a different building. August 1st, Bill's convinced that Henry Ford, he's a long time, he just never gave up this idea that Henry Ford would be the perfect person to write a forward to the book. Henry Ford was a super dry. He was a guy who was famous for being against alcohol. Bill writes a long letter on October 1st to the Detroit friend, hoping to get an introduction to Ford, but nothing ever comes of that. August 5th, we got the Alcoholics Foundation. If we're going to have all this money, we need a tax-exempt kind of formal foundation. That alcoholic fund that Hank had set up in May, we need something much more formal. So we got trustees, we got a couple of Rockefeller guys, we got the lawyer who pro bono did the work. We got Bill Rudell and Dr. Bob Smith as trustees. And there's also an advisory committee. There's 2 more Rockefeller guys, Scott and Chipman, followed by Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst. So we've got all this stuff set up. This foundation will later morph into the current board of trustees and the General Service Office and eventually the General Service Conference. But this was all set up so that they could take care of the money that they're going to get so they could build these hospitals and pay these missionaries and workers. August 8th, Bill writes to Fitz about a judge they got in touch with, and he's anxious to help them establish an AA hospital in Washington, D.C. Well, Bill said this whole hospital thing just went south. They didn't pay any attention to it after those first months or so. Wrong. Bill and Fitz waste almost the entire month of August chasing this prospect, only to have that particular plan go up in smoke at the end. So finally, after 3 solid months of chasing testimonials and working to establish an AA hospital in DC and frantic and fruitless attempts to save money, they still got nothing. They got nothing. They got no money. The Rockefeller people, who are supposedly their great connection to all these rich people in New York, they're just not getting it done. And at this point, all of their attention is still on finding donors willing to make large contributions to their plans for a string of national hospitals and paid alcoholic workers. This singular focus on the absolute necessity for hospitals and paid workers as the most efficient way of spreading the message can be perplexing to modern AAs. Like, what the hell was in the, what were these guys thinking about? Where's that coming from? But you need to remember that this is exactly how the plan was working at this time in both New York and Akron. In New York City, they're getting most of their prospects out of town hospitals. And in Akron, Dr. Bob is regularly admitting alcoholics to the local hospital using false diagnosis because they hate taking alcoholics. So he makes up things and gets them in there. So this whole thing of primary treatment being hospitals, and the fact that hospitals don't want to take alcoholics, we need our own alcoholic hospitals. It's right in the front of Bill and Hank's mind here. And all the active people at AA that are working, Bill, Hank, Fitz, Dr. Bob, they're all dead broke, and they desperately need to get enough money just to keep themselves afloat so that they continue this recovery work with active alcoholics. We need hospitals, we need paid workers. Bob's getting a small monthly check, but Bill and Fitz are piling up, and Hank are piling up debts, and they haven't raised any money. Hank Parkhurst has a plan. He's got a new plan here, okay? He's my guy. There's a Sunday newspaper supplement called This Week. It goes in newspapers all across the country. It's printed in New York, but it goes all across the country. Got a circulation of 5 million. They know a guy who has an in at this magazine. He's going to write an article about their cure and get it placed in This Week magazine. And Hank says, when you write that article, Silas Bent was going to do that. He says, in that article, I want you to offer several chapters of the book for $1. And he says, you know, who could object to $1? I mean, it's the price of a pint of cheap whiskey. I mean, if you're looking for salvation of your own life or your family, you'd be happy to send us $1 and get several chapters. Oh, but Bill, we have a problem. It's the middle of September and we only have 2 chapters. And people are going to expect more like 5 chapters for their $1. So Bill Wilson starts writing again on September 15, 1938, so that he can have more chapters for this plan of offering them in This Week magazine. This Week, they never accepted for publication. So another one of Hank's plans goes up in smoke. This is another one of those many turning points in early A history. Having committed to writing 3 more chapters, Bill realized he just wanted to finish the book. So they've abandoned any idea that the Rockefeller men are going to help them financially. They commit to finding money elsewhere, and the book holds the best promise for funding those ongoing efforts. So the new revised plan was to get the book written and published as soon as possible. And back in early June, when Bill was first writing those first 2 chapters, Hank wrote this thing called Hank's Ideas, and he calculated there were 3 million prospective buyers for this book. I mean, they are going to sell, these books are going to be sold by the carload, and they're talking about railroad carload. We're just going to sell tons and tons of this book. Sales of the book will at least provide the current workers when it first starts with the much needed cash. And as sales grew, those profits would help them finance the plan to establish alcoholic hospitals and pay for the workers necessary to establish staff and fill the beds of those hospitals. Bill Wilson almost accepts an offer from Harper and Brothers to publish the big book, but Hank talks him out of it. Why give all those profits to some non-alcoholic publisher? We should publish this book ourselves and keep all that money. We need the money. The Rockefeller people are crazy. They say, are you guys out of your mind? You don't know anything about publishing a book. And but Hank prevails in his arguments over Bill. And once again, Hank Parkhurst has a plan. They're going to form their own company, the 100 Men Corporation. They're going to sell stock for $25 a share. And that money's going to support the Parkhurst family while the book is being prepared. And then the money's really going to start rolling in. And at the same time, Charlie Towns makes a commitment to pay Bill Wilson $300 a month for 5 months. That's $200 for Bill and $100 for Ruth Hawk, so that he can devote himself to writing the rest of the big book. Then, once it's published, this book's profits will not only fund their paid workers, those profits will eventually also finance the founding of alcoholics hospitals all over the country. And here's just the plan: is they're going to sell 200 shares at $25 each. Hank gets $5,000. He creates a prospectus that all but guarantees a huge return on the investment. Look at this. If you sell 15,000 copies, you get $10, get your $25 back plus $10. 50,000 copies, 75. And some people say we're even going to sell 500,000 copies. We're going to sell 500,000 copies of this book. Think of this. Man, what a great return on investment for your $25. Note that the plan was to sell 200 shares at $25 each, but then Bill and Hank were each going to be gifted. There were 600 shares of stock. They're each going to get 200 shares for their work as writer and promoter of the big book. This is a very generous payment for those land. I mean, look, if you sell 50,000 books, you get $15,000. I mean, that's just look. I think this is probably the only misstep I think these guys really made during this early days. The problem with the stock issue plan were huge. And Bill and Hank handed over their shares back to the foundation a few months later, and all of the shares sold were eventually bought back and retired by the foundation. So this was a temporary stop thing, but it was not a good plan, and it was retired early. This plan to use the book's profits to finance the rapid expansion of AA's Cure all across the country never happened. The book's profits never rose to that kind of a level. They had no real distribution system for the book, and it didn't really start selling until after the Saturday Evening Post article of AA in March of 1941. So all of those ambitious plans to spread the message of recovery nationally finally came to naught. As it turned out, hospitals and paid missionaries were not the best way to get most people to adopt their cure. After gravity, perhaps the most powerful law in the universe is the law of unintended consequences. I love that. And that certainly proved to be true shortly after the big book was published on April 10th, 1939. Bill and Hank were clearly focused on hospitals and paid workers as the primary vehicle for spreading their cure. But they also had hopes that the book all by itself would be able to get people sober once they read it. And that hope seemed to be spectacularly confirmed when a California guy read the multilith copy and he stopped drinking. And this caused so much excitement that the people in New York collected money so that he could take a bus from California to New York. But unfortunately, when the bus arrived, the guy was found dead drunk and asleep under a seat in the back of the bus. So much for getting sober and staying sober on the book alone. So maybe the book alone would not be able to get and keep people sober. But what happened next was completely unexpected by everybody. It turned out that hospitals and paid workers were not going to be the spark that lit the AA fire. That spark came when the new big book was combined with non-Oxford group AA meetings. The resulting blaze was almost immediate and truly impressive in how quickly it spread. On May 10th, 1939, this is just 1 month to the day after the big book was published, Clarence Schneider from Cleveland tells Dr. Bob that he and the rest of the Cleveland guys are not going to be driving down to Akron on Wednesday nights anymore for that meeting with the alcoholic squad and the local Oxford group people. We're done with that, Clarence says. Now, Clarence says, now that they had a program as laid out in the big book, they didn't need all that Oxford group folderol. So they're going to start their own alcoholics only meeting, no Oxford group people allowed, the next night in Cleveland using the big book and the 12 steps as their only guide. Clarence always claimed that the Cleveland meeting held on May 11th, 1939 was the very first AA meeting ever held in the world anywhere. And forever after, Clarence proclaimed himself to be a co-founder of AA because he was the guy who made that meeting happen. And I note that this argument being made here today goes a long way towards supporting Clarence's claim, something I didn't really believe in too much until I started doing research for this presentation. The growth of the Cleveland group was literally explosive, literally. By the end of 1939, just 7 months after it started, there were 3 groups in Cleveland. 3 groups. And the number of sober alcoholics was doubling in Cleveland every 6 months. As Ernie Kurtz noted in Not God, Cleveland became the testing ground for what Alcoholics Anonymous was to be. And that was to be was firmly based on this new combination that Clarence invents of an alcoholics-only fellowship and the 12 steps as explained in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. AA, as we know it today, is an emergent property of these 2 essential elements. I don't know. We got a second. Emergent property is one of those things that just happens that nobody expects it to happen, that nobody could predict is going to happen. The classic example of what an emergent property is water. A scientist could know every absolute fact there is about hydrogen and every fact you could know about oxygen, but you could still never predict that if you put H2O together, that you'd get a liquid compound that would freeze at 32 degrees and expand, the only thing in the universe that expands when it gets cold, and then it would turn into steam at 212. You could not, those are emergent properties of putting oxygen and hydrogen together that are completely unpredictable. And what we have here is the big book and Alcoholics Only meetings coming together, and bang, all of a sudden, everything is different. Everything is different. So despite all of Bill and Hank's beliefs and months of efforts, the success of AA did not hinge on the establishment of a string of alcoholic hospitals all across the country that would be supported by a small army of paid workers. Bill Wilson always strenuously denied Clarence Snyder's claim that the first real AA meeting was held in Cleveland on May 11, 1939. He argued that Alcoholics Only meetings were being held in his home in Brooklyn for almost 2 years before that, and there's certainly some truth to that claim. But as Lois, so here's one example. Lois writes to Bill, he's off traveling, April 24th, 1938, and this is the meeting she described. She says, there were 14 here at the house today. I thought it was going to be terrible because all the old-time men went off in little groups and left the 2 new guys with the women, and Fitz was sick and terribly off the ball, but later everyone got together and Fitz made a grand and short witness. West was fine and Paul was funny and tearful at the same time. Hank led. Now, clearly that sounds like an AA meeting today. I mean, that's as close as we got. Certainly doesn't sound like what's going on out in Akron, which doesn't sound like an AA meeting today. But that meeting, those meetings had no big book and no 12 steps. The steps weren't written until early December of 1938, and they're not made public until the day the book was published on April 10th, 1939. So I think we must give some credibility to Clarence's claim that although the book did not sell by the carloads for almost a decade, Clarence Snyder's combination of Alcoholics Only meetings with the big book and the 12 steps most certainly did bring in new members by the caller and created this great explosion of activity in Alcoholics Anonymous. So once AA started to adopt the path that was created and test-driven in Cleveland, the growth of the fellowship was dramatic in the extreme. Finally, the vision and the plan have come together in a meaningful way. Finally, one that ensured the successful growth of the fellowship to its current membership of over 2 million people worldwide, and all those millions of people have been made sober in the last 80 plus years. It's been a long journey with many fits and starts and even more disappointments, but these all proved to be valuable lessons learned, which eventually led to the spectacular success of AA's program of recovery in a way that nobody had ever planned.